All right. Thank you so much for joining me, Marianne. I'm so excited to get to talk to you. So, this is the Green Mountain Disability Stories podcast. My name is Adrienne Meow, and I am a Community Services Coordinator at CDCI. And today I have with me Marianne Lewis. I'm so excited to talk about her various connections to Vermont, to disability advocacy, and to being a family member of someone with a disability. Marianne, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and about how you got into the profession that you ended up pursuing?
So I am an occupational therapist, currently retired, although I've maintained my license. Um, I knew growing up, I just always wanted to be in a helping profession. I was thinking I wanted to be a PT because I think, like the rest of the world, I knew more about PT than I did OT. It was actually my older brother who was an influence. He was studying pre-med at a college that also had an OT major. And he said, "Why PT? Why not OT?" And I said, "Because I don't really know much about it." And he said, "Well, let me introduce you to some of my OT friends." And so I spent a little time on the campus with him. And then I started um, volunteering for different OT departments to see what it was really truly like. And so he is exactly almost 4 years ahead of me. So he was gone off campus when I was entered as a freshman, but it was really my brother who was influential in kind of guiding me that direction.
Well, okay, so this is a great transition to ask a little bit about your family. Do you mind sharing a little bit about your family
No,
and
not at all. So, George and I were married for 7 years before we took the plunge to have kids. We kind of had Europe on the bucket list and get a house on the bucket list. And so, I was, I guess, pregnant at 30, ended up in the hospital on the long term, kind of high risk OBGYN unit. I had been minding my own business, sitting in a grad class at Hopkins. And at that point, I was 20 weeks pregnant when my water broke, and so that was kind of the beginning of uh, a, a long and a short bed rest. So I was on bed rest in the hospital in entirety for 6 weeks. Which feels like a long time. I wish it could have been longer. At 26 weeks, I had to have an emergency C-section, and Patrick was born. So he was then in the NICU for about 3.5 months, about 14 weeks premature. That was just about how long he was in the NICU. Um, and then when Patrick, well, it was kind of a process, but eventually when Patrick was 7, we ended up adopting 2 kids. They're siblings, and they were in the US foster care system, and they were out in Colorado. So we journeyed out there. There was quite a transition of getting to know them through their therapist. And they wanted George and I to just go. And we said, you know what, Patrick's part of the family. We're not going without Patrick. But we did realize there would be times when we, the very first meeting may not have been, it might have been overwhelming to meet Patrick at that point. So then my parents said, well, we'll go along too. So it was quite the contingency that went along to Colorado. And it was a week of us visiting them at their foster home to them staying with us at the hotel and just visiting the foster home. So it was kind of a interesting transition. And so we went to Colorado as a group of 5. We came back as a group of 7.
wow.
So, um, so those 2, Dustin and Desiree, have had been in 6 different foster homes by the age of 5 and 6. So they're all very close. They're about a year, at that point they were 5, 6, and 7. And so I had 3 kids on 3 IEPs. um, and so um, that's probably a story for a whole nother day. But
Well,
yeah, they're doing very well. They're all on their own now and independent. With Patrick lives with us, but Dustin and Desiree are living on their own. So
oh, that's wonderful. So, can I ask? It sounds like you probably had to start explaining disability to children at a fairly early age when children were fairly young.
Yes, absolutely. And kids are actually sometimes more understanding and more accepting than adults are. Patrick loves the pool. He always has loved to swim. And so we kind of planned it that the first time, and we knew that Justin and Desiree really enjoyed the water. And so we made sure we had a hotel that had a pool. Patrick was already in the pool. His wheelchair was off to the side, and he was swimming happily in his sort of way that he swims. I always say it's kind of like a convoluted butterfly. He really is amazing in the water. And so the kids met Patrick in the pool. And so I kind of felt like that leveled the playing field a little bit. And everyone was just splashing and playing and having a good time. And I don't even think they really realized initially that Patrick was not verbal. Everyone was just so excited and wound up and happy to be swimming. So, and then we just kind of answered questions honestly as it came. We had sent them a big scrapbook ahead of time. And so in there, we had pictures of Patrick in his wheelchair, pictures of the ramp at the house, pictures of the adapted lift van. And some explanation of Patrick doesn't see, Patrick, uses different ways to communicate than we do. And so his legs don't work like yours and ours do. And so they had some introduction before they had met Patrick.
Oh, I love that. I just think it's such a thoughtful and creative and a very OT way to think about sort of play as the common thread and bringing people together
Right.
in a setting that's very comfortable for children and very exciting. Yeah.
So the funniest, we took a lot of pictures, as you can imagine, that first meeting in the pool. The funniest picture is my dad diving. My dad was a very good swimmer, diving right above the sign that says no diving. And the kids never let him forget, especially as they got older and they like to look at those pictures. They're like, look at grandpa, he's a rule breaker.
This is where you got the silo thing. It was
right
down.
Right. It's not my fault.
Had you worked in pediatrics at all, or were you an adult OT?
No, I had worked in adult OT. I had always done adult rehab. One of my internships was in adult rehab, and I really enjoyed it. And that's what I was kind of comfortable in. And so I had always done adult rehab. After Patrick was born, I thought, oh, there's a whole world of pediatrics I never really thought much about. And I quickly learned that they're not just little adults.
No, right.
I'm like, reflexes. Let me go back to my textbook. I guess I would have said internet had it been now, but there was no internet at that point. So I switched. I transitioned to I had been at that point and a director of a fairly large OT department in a hospital in Baltimore that had rehab, it had acute care, and it had inpatient. But so I switched to a pediatric hospital, and I feel like it was kind of this symbiotic relationship. I was learning what I was doing with the kids, and I'd kind of take it home and do it with Patrick. And then I'd get an idea when he was at therapy, and I'd be like, oh, that's a good idea for such and such. So it kind of worked both ways. And I was there about 2 years, and then I transitioned to the Maryland School for the Blind. Patrick was actually there as a student in the infant toddler program.
Wow,
And
okay.
so I went on Fridays to, understand the program more. And I'll never forget, he was on a platform swing with an OT. And she said, so what do you do? And I said, well, actually, I'm an OT. So she said, we just lost our supervisor. You want to come? So I was like, well, I think that's a conflict of interest. Well, every Friday, I met this therapist with Patrick on the swing, and every Friday she's like, did you change your mind yet? And so anyway, I thought, well, summer's off. There's something to be said for that. And if it is a conflict of interest, I can find another OT job in a second, and Patrick can stay put. And so 16 years later, I was still there and loving it, and probably would still be there to this day if we hadn't moved to Vermont, which again is another story.
So, could you tell us a little bit more about Patrick and what it was like maybe in the early years when he started in the school system?
Well, so let me back up because I don't think I've really told you Patrick's diagnosis.
Yeah.
The first diagnosis that Patrick received was um, retinopathy of prematurity, and we suspected that he actually was hearing impaired, which he is not, but he loved his baby swing and he would always position his head a certain way. And we thought that he was trying to hear better out of maybe one ear. As it turned out, he had a little bit of like vision left, and he was trying to see. So it was the pediatrician that picked up that he was not getting that red light reflex, and so that was his first diagnosis, was blind. And I think that one, being his first, probably hit George and I the hardest.
Mhm.
Um, and that's where Patrick's love of water came in, because I wasn't sure at that point whether he was going to be ambulatory or not. And I had visions of Patrick wandering into a pond. Why he would be unsupervised and wander into a pond is beyond me. But I kept thinking he's going to fall into a body of water when he's ambulating. And he needs to learn to swim. And so he learned to swim to survive really and have fun in the water at a very young age.
Okay.
His next diagnosis was cerebral palsy. And actually, probably in between, it was just probably that global um, developmental delay, because they don't usually label CP until you're probably three-ish. But the cerebral palsy label, by that point, was, I don't want to say obvious, but it was easier to accept because it was a little more obvious, and Patrick had been getting early intervention and OT and PT and speech. Um, and um, so at CP, spastic diplegic, and we were both okay with that diagnosis because it also made insurance coverage for therapies, for wheelchair, different positioning devices more readily available. Then there's the switch from, and I'm not really talking about school, but I'll get there. There's the switch from the stroller to the wheelchair. And I'm thinking that probably happened at like 3 or 4-ish. Um, Patrick was a pretty little guy. And it was a pretty little wheelchair. But I remember all summer long taking Patrick to the community pool in his stroller, and the summers before. And then one day I took him to the pool in the wheelchair. And the difference it kind of made me feel, which was probably perceived more by me than anybody else, but that, again, that's a whole nother lecture. But that was a transition. And then Patrick went from early intervention to preschool, and then and in preschool at the Maryland School for the Blind, all the kids are together. They're not put into silos, so to speak, because then once they reach five-ish, they go into a designated program. Whether it's the academic program, these are going to be Braille readers, they're going to travel with their canes. Or the program that serviced kids that were autistic, or the kids that were learning more life skills. And so Patrick was in what they called the life program, which was learning in functional environments. Um, and so, I think that was a bit of a transition very early on in the IEP process. We had to designate, was Patrick diploma bound or was he certificate bound? And that was kind of a difficult adjustment at that point. I think truthfully, the hardest transition or hardest diagnosis to accept was when the psychologist labeled Patrick mentally retarded. And I, realized that we don't use that term anymore, but that was his initial diagnosis. And I kind of went into like defense mode and I said, but he said pizza last night. And because she labeled him severe and profound. And I just was like, that's not true. He's very smart, you know, and I kind of went into that defensive parent mode. Um, and ultimately, I think her diagnosis was spot on. I just wasn't ready to hear it. And this is where it was different for my husband and I. I was very ready to accept the wheelchair because as a therapist, I'm like, man, that umbrella stroller is just not cutting it anymore. His posture looks abysmal. And George did much better with the diagnosis of MR. He said, you know, Marianne, Patrick is the same Patrick he was yesterday as he is today. So he kind of helped me get over that.
I really appreciate you sharing about these different labels and these different time points where things really hit you as a
Mhm.
parent.
Mhm.
And I can really appreciate the difference with your therapist eyes, thinking about things like that transition from stroller to wheelchair does feel like a disclosure, right? It can be a
Right.
real sign that he is going to be using a wheelchair. And and then to hear, but you also recognize the access that that would give him and the postural support and sort of all the utility of using a wheelchair as an extension of your body. And then to have your husband in this other position where there were other points where he was grappling with. And I'm really struck by, you know, these meetings where you're having these discussions with professionals, and you're bringing both of these lenses to it at the same time. That really is a really emotional time point. And I'm curious about this other thing that you mentioned, the putting him on a diploma bound track versus a certificate track. Do you recall about how old he was when that decision happened?
Well, I think it was fairly young,
Okay.
but I think, and I think early on he was pegged for the certificate track. But the kind of softening at the IEP meeting was, and we can review this every year.
Mhm.
So, you know, if things drastically change, we can review this every year. Um, the reason there was a delineation in Maryland was that there were certain tests you had to pass to get a diploma. Um, Interestingly, when we moved to Vermont and Patrick completed school in a Vermont public school system, he did indeed receive a diploma. Now, long term for Patrick, it doesn't matter. It didn't make a difference one way or the other. But it was just an interesting difference of state politics, so to speak, or
Right.
policies.
And sort of being confronted with these in these times when you're navigating the school system, of having to deal with this other aspect of labeling or diagnosis.
Right.
Yeah. Oh, thank you for sharing that. So, can I ask, when did your family move to Vermont? Was that
Winter of 2009, and
okay?
that was instigated by, well, that was a family decision, but it was my husband who really wanted to own his own business. And we both kept kind of turning to how about running a bed and breakfast. And so we started off looking in Florida because he thought that would be fun to sail and golf. And I kept pushing us further north. And we had actually met in Stowe on a bicycle trip. And I grew up in a skiing family that came to Stowe quite a bit. My brother went to UVM. And so I we ended up looking at an inn that was for sale in Chester. And I said, I don't think that's where we want to go. I've really, you know, not a highly populated area. Let's look in Stowe. And it had a 3-bedroom owner's quarters. It was accessible uh, to the most part. We kind of tweaked it to make it a little more accessible. And so then that's how we ended up in Stowe. We have since sold that in after 13 years, and have retired and are living a little bit further north.
Okay. And when you made that big move, your three kids were all in the school system at that time.
Yes, yes, which was interesting. Patrick had always been in a highly supported non-public school, so it wasn't a private school, it wasn't a public school. It was all special education children. That was considered the least restrictive environment for all of them, 180 of these students from the whole state of Maryland. So it was actually had a boarding school 5 nights for kids who were either needed the self-care skills and the socialization or were too far to travel on a daily basis. Um, Patrick was a day student, but he went from that where there was literally 6 kids in each of the life skills classroom, one special educator and one, if not two, para educators, to a public school, where quite honestly, I don't know that they had ever had anyone as involved as Patrick. A very receptive special educator who said, wait, what? You worked at his school? Can you kind of help me set up his program? So I was thrilled to be able to do that. And I said, well, you know what? He uses this switch to interface with the computer. And these are some of the programs he uses. We were trying to come up with a suitable adaptive PE for him. And we had joined a swimming hole, indoor pool. And I said, what if we took him Tuesday afternoons or whatever works for his schedule and go with Patrick to the pool every week, and that becomes his adaptive PE. They were thrilled with that. His job was just kind of, the concept was developing. And so Patrick was designated to have a one-on-one aide at the public school, which in his other setting, he didn't need a one-on-one because it was such a small student staff ratio to begin with. But in this setting, he had a one-on-one. So the one-on-one actually came to the house 3 mornings a week because as you learn about Patrick's business, there was a lot of stuff. There was assistive technology, there were ingredients, there were switches. And so it was easier for her to come to the house, and then the school bus would pick him up, take him for the rest of the day to school, and then the aide would meet him there. So that worked out really well. So I'm very thankful because it was like kind of like a mini school for the blind within Stowe Public High School, because they were so very willing to make it work. One day we were at an Oktoberfest, George and Patrick and I, we were also on the rec path with Patrick, and kids who knew Patrick, that we didn't know them and we didn't know they knew Patrick, stopped and said hello and talked to him when they didn't have to, because they could have just passed by and we didn't know they were in his class. So I think bottom line, they were a very welcoming group.
I'm curious, sort of from your greater social support or family network, was that a difficult transition from Maryland? Did you feel like you were well connected to a lot of other local families or families with children with disabilities?
Um, that's a good question. I feel like, we didn't have family per se in Baltimore, so our family always had to make it a trip to visit us. And so we had a lot of visits. Of course, now we live in Stowe, and we own an inn. So of course we had a lot of family visits. Oh, and P.S. We're not really here to help you. We're here to ski. No, they were very supportive. But in terms of other families, I think that took a little while to grow. And I can't even remember really who started it, but there was a wine and wine club and it started out for special needs moms, and it kind of morphed to be special needs parents. And so very quickly, I think people realized I should be included in the wine and wine club. And so I got to know quite a few parents. I also figured out pretty quickly that if I got into activities that involved people with disabilities, that would be a good connection. So I joined the board at Lamoille County Mental Health Services. I joined the board of Green Mountain Adaptive Sports, as you well know. And that has really connected me to a lot of resources. Again, it's kind of that symbiotic relationship. I feel like I'm helping those organizations out, but they're helping me out too, in terms of like, oh, I never knew that was an option, or oh, that's a great resource. I'll put that in my bag of tricks. So,
Right. Okay. So can we talk a little bit? I'm curious about how and when you started to think about post high school transition. And I'm guessing because you had been in pediatric and school-based OT that maybe you had that on your horizon a little bit earlier than many people do.
very, very
How did
true.
that sort of change over time as you thought about what might be good options?
Well, I think I kind of started in total denial. Patrick's only 5, I don't need to think about it. Patrick's only 6, I don't need to think about it. Patrick's only 7, I don't need to think about it. And then once we adopted the other 2, um, it's very important to do your homework. It's very important to study hard. It's very important to, do well in school. Um, and I remember one day, Desiree, who was probably 8 or 9 at the time, said, "Mom, is Patrick going to go to college?" And I
Mm.
said, "No, I don't think so, Desiree." And I said, "Well," and she said, "Well, why not?" And I said, "Well, I just think college might be too hard for him." And she said, "Well, what is he going to when he grows up?" And I got very teary-eyed and I said, "You know what? I don't know yet. I have not figured that out." And she said, "Oh, I know. His job will be to make everyone happy." And truthfully, her little nuggets of wisdom at her little age comforted me and carried me for quite a while, because I thought, you know what? Patrick is such a happy soul. He loves to sing, he lights up a room, and Patrick's job will be to make people happy. So I carried that kind of as my comfort for a while. And then I was facilitating functional life planning meetings at school, and that really became my passion and my thing. Um, Looking at involving the entire team, the parents, anyone the parents wanted to invite that were important to the child, and really looking at the child's strengths and interests, not what they can't do, what can they do. And really trying to come up with job carving and individualized jobs for these very unique students. And meanwhile, I kept thinking, Patrick's option at that point in my head was this one particular medical daycare center. And it just didn't sit well with me, because, and this was kind of um, Maryland's philosophy. They were still into sheltered workshops. They were still in a very non-inclusionary sort of a model. They grouped a lot of people with like medical and intellectual needs together. And I thought, Patrick is going to sit in front of a movie he can't see. Not going to mean anything to him unless it's a musical. Then they're going to take them bowling and it's going to be hand over hand. Well, you can't hand over hand someone who's using their hands as their eyes. Well, I can't say you can't, but at, hand over hand, hand under hand is not Patrick's favorite. You could put him in front of a glitter craft and he'd be like, "You want me to do what now?" Like, and he'd have glitter all over him, which is okay, but not the purpose. And it just didn't feel right to me. So I kept thinking, well, what will Patrick do when he grows up? And Patrick's OT, which is the same one I met on that platform swing 12 plus years ago, had said, "You know what? Patrick uses this hand motion." And since he was a boy, we said, "It's hand farts. There's no other way to describe it." And how can we capitalize on that? And that is a long way from where he is now, but that's kind of the mentality of how it started. So between Tracy, that OT, and me, mom slash OT, we said, well, you know what? We're looking to buy a bed and breakfast. what if Patrick makes bath salts? So he used Epsom salts and he used scents, like different smells and different food colorings. And he mashed the bath salts together within a Ziploc baggie using his hand motion. And
Right.
that worked really well. And then it was like, okay, now what is he going to do with the bath salts? So Patrick was very he loves switches. He's very good with switches. He's got cause and effect down to a T. So he had used a pouring device to help water plants, help dump the eggs in the cake mix, help make the milkshake. So it was like, well, what if he uses his pouring device to and a funnel and little containers, and he pushes the switch to pour the bath salts. So Patrick's organic products pop into freshness with Patrick's organic products, which in retrospect, we were like, probably not really organic, but it worked for the title. So that was a very short flash in the pan. Um, because we moved to Vermont with our little teeny things of bath salts, and he sold them at the school store. And, it wasn't a real lucrative business, but it was something to do. Um, and so we buy an inn, we move to the inn, all the rooms have Whirlpool tubs. P.S. You can't use bath salts in a Whirlpool tub because it's corrosive to the jets. So we're like, okay, so much for the inn buying the bath salts and supplying them and selling them in the armoire. And also, more importantly, right around that time, unfortunately, kids started snorting bath salts. And so bath salts became kind of contraband. And I'm like, great, we don't need to be making contraband substances. And I will never forget, we had a couple that stayed with us at the inn for 2 weeks from Belfast, had bought maybe 4 or 5 of Patrick's little containers of bath salts and got delayed at an airport in Ireland because why do you have bath salts? So they had to like give them up, which, it was only $1 a product at that point. So no harm, no foul. But so that was when we said, okay, that's got to stop. So then I think the business just kept evolving. So I think the next thing we did was Patrick's produce. And that looked like, okay, what is Patrick going to do? So we had lots of marigold flowers around the inn. And when they dry in the fall, there's tons of little marigold seeds. And Patrick could kind of use that same motion, and the seeds would come out, and we'd collect them on his lap tray and put them, that would be Patrick's produce. We also cut up a million cantaloupes, honeydew, watermelon. Was there something Patrick could do with these seeds? Less so. He kind of used the baggy formula to, pull some of the pulp off. That was a little harder to do. So, these seeds got moldy. It really wasn't a big market. So we're like, okay, that really didn't work. So concurrently, Patrick loves the water and I like to knit. So I'm like, Patrick can dye wool. And then I thought, well, I don't really want him dyeing wool with anything because he puts his hands in his eyes and his face a lot. So we thought, well, Kool-Aid's pretty innocent. So we used Kool-Aid and vinegar to dye wool. And so Patrick would slosh around, and then we'd have this big jumbled mess of wool that I had to ball up. And so we sold wool for a while. I still have some of that in my stash. But it was orange, it was lime, it was lemon, it was cherry, it was strawberry. And there's a finite need for Kool-Aid colored yarn. And so that was kind of a flash in the pan. Every once in a while, once we got to the farmer's market stage, someone would buy a ball of yarn, but that was just a concept that kind of came and went. Along the same lines, and this is making headway towards the final product, is we thought about dog treats, and Patrick could make dog treats, pre-made dog treats. Well, the recipe we used at that point really smelled strongly. And George would say, "No, don't do them on a Friday at noon because guests are checking in at 3 and it really smells." And they didn't have preservatives, so they had a very short shelf life. Um, and so I kind of felt like we had the wool, we had the seeds, we had the dog treats, and what are we like? I just need to tie this together. So at the same time, we had a graphic designer who was helping us with some graphics for the inn because we inherited like cut and paste stationery, and we were like, no, no, it needs to be more professional than that. So we had this phenomenal graphic designer, and when she was done with kind of our project, I said, Sally, I need a little help pulling this together for Patrick. He's got this, he's got this, he's got this. They don't relate. None of them are really, worth much for resale. I don't really know where we're going. Do you have any thoughts? And she said, well, what? Oh, and furthermore, Patrick didn't really like the gooiness of the dog cookies. And then you had to use hand over hand to stamp out the dog. It just was not his thing. So Sally said, well, what if you had a recipe that people could take the dog treats home and make them themselves? So I thought, I'm not sure how I'm envisioning this, but okay, thanks, I'll look into it. So I jump online, and the very first recipe I see is in a ball jar, a mason jar. And it just went off like a light bulb. And I thought, you know what? Patrick could use his pouring device and make layered dog treats. So then I realized to make them look good, we could use Sally's graphic designs to help us come up with a logo for Patrick, colors for Patrick, a name. She helped us, because at this point I'm calling it Patrick's Pantry. She came up with the purely Patrick concept, which I loved. Because to this day, we still say it's purely Patrick. If he gets a large order, it's not about us hurrying up and doing it for him. It's Patrick's job, and it's purely Patrick. So she developed all the hang tags. She helped us with business cards for him. She was really instrumental. And so then we realized, well, dog cookies are great, but what about people cookies? And so we researched some other recipes, and then we threw a soup in there. And so basically they're cookie starters, soup starters. He's now up to 22 different products. He started with 5. There's been some along the road, pardon the pun. Rocky roads did not make it. They were way too dry. And I thought, okay, we don't need those. There's some, he's on I do his QuickBooks. And so I really track what is selling well. But the whole thing, I think, kept evolving. And I guess that's my point, is that's the way I think, kind of like, oh, that didn't work. Oh, okay, that's kind of working, but not really. Oh, so I don't feel like you have to have the idea at the get-go, because even, for example, shipping for Patrick. So eventually we said, you know what, Patrick's selling at the inn, he's selling at a craft show here, and he's selling at a farmer's market here. What about an online presence? And so his job coach helped us develop a website through GoDaddy. I often say that if Patrick came across a lot of money, he would have a professional photographer versus his mom and her cell phone to take pictures of his things, but that's not quite in his budget. So then, when you have an online website, you need to figure out shipping. So that in and of itself was an evolution. We shipped in the ball jar to my sister-in-law in Colorado, just kind of as a experiment. One jar made it, one jar was broken, and there were lentils and beans all over the place. So we said, okay, that won't work. So then we tried peanut butter containers that you can order, just empty, clean peanut butter containers. They kind of looked like empty peanut butter containers. There was not a whole lot of wow to them, and they were bigger, and so you needed more nuts to finish it, more chocolate chips, more pasta. It was kind of like not real cost effective for Patrick. So then we went to more of a plastic bag with a gusseted flat bottom. These were cellophane. So again, we shipped to Colorado because that's going to be by air as opposed to ground. And the seams popped open because it's a non-pressurized cargo. So that didn't work. And, thankfully we had only ordered 500 of them and not 5,000 of them. So then for a while we taped the sides of the bags so that they wouldn't pop. But that didn't look too attractive. And so it just kept going, it just kept evolving to the point where we then came up with the concept of a reusable water bottle. And was a 16-ounce equal to a pint? In reality, yes. Was the 32-ounce water bottle equal to a 32-ounce quart jar? Yes. And so we ship in these reusable BPA-free water bottles that happen to have Patrick's branding and logo on them. And that has worked really well for shipping. We have actually taken it a step further because Patrick's now selling his products to stores throughout Stowe. He's in several different stores, and also across the country. There is a lot of stores that are selling products just made by people with disabilities and staffed by people with disabilities, which has been really exciting. But we wanted something a little more tamper-proof than a water bottle, which was sitting on a shelf kind of unguarded. So it's not foolproof, but we ended up finding FDA approved barrier bags. So it's barrier from sun, heat, humidity, moisture. And so when Patrick does his products that are being shipped to Nebraska or Colorado or North Carolina, they're all going in these tamper-proof bags, and he gets the same label. And instead, we have an additional Purely Patrick sticker that goes on them.
It strikes me how much this has become a family business, and that you, like you said, it's a lot of trial and error and a lot of creative thinking and trying different mechanisms to make it work, and that it has been an evolution. And I love that it started with this collaboration where you, as his family, knew that there was a particular hand motion that he did a lot of. His therapist at school was also thinking about different ways that he was using that motion. Was some of this happening while he was still in the school system, the early days of the business?
Yes. So when he was still at the Maryland School for the Blind, that was the bath salt phase.
Okay.
And then when he moved to Vermont, that's when we quickly realized the bath salt phase needed to phase out. And so we were pretty new at the end because, like I said, we were just getting our graphics done when we had the concept. And so, yes, it probably not day one at the school, but I would say from maybe, somewhere in the first part of his first year he was there, that's when his one-on-one aide started coming to the house and making these products to see, was it really something Patrick wanted to do and enjoyed doing? And could we sell these? So yes, he continued to do that. We then got involved with a designated agency who had an employment coordinator who helped guide us through the funding process. In Vermont, it's called Going to Equity. And so she took Patrick's kind of big plan of what it looked like. What are we asking for in terms of a job coach, which is really a CIS, Community Integrated Support. What are we looking for in terms of respite? What does Patrick need to access his environment, like an adaptive transportation fund? And so she kind of formulates that package, and then that employment specialist takes it to Equity, which I kind of picture it being like a big table with lots of these employment coordinators from all over the state presenting to the state and saying, this is what we would like, and them granting it or partially granting it. We were very fortunate. Patrick was granted 25 hours a week of a job coach, which is exactly what we asked for. Assuming that, if he didn't need or want to necessarily work 40 hours a week. He needed some time to swim, do his adaptive skiing, um, chill out, get a break from his wheelchair and just chill out in bed. Um, just to relax. I mean, like we all need. So we asked for 25 hours a week and we got 25 hours a week. He's not quite at that level now, but it's not because of funding, it's because of people availability at the agency, which is obviously chronic everywhere. I'm not sure I answered your original question.
Well, no, I was just thinking about how school had helped collaborate with you through some of this process, which I think you did speak to, which is helpful. And I was curious what work looks like now for Patrick, which you've also been speaking to, because I know he also has a lot of other hobbies and occupations that he is doing for recreation. So yeah, could you talk a little bit more about what Patrick does for fun and how he balances work and fun these days?
Sure. So Patrick works now Monday through Thursday. So Monday is a short day, 8 to 12. Tuesday has become a longer day because of the Friday piece missing. So Tuesday is now 8 to 3. Wednesday is 8 to 12:30, and Thursday is 8 to 2. So it's kind of different every day. Patrick's Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday person has been with him for 13 plus years. So we're very fortunate because they're a very good match for each other, and we're thrilled to have her. His Thursday component is brand new. And so, we're still kind of on a learning curve with everything from how do you use the Hoyer lift to getting medication trained from the agency. But so Patrick's fairly structured in those days. Sometimes he's working on actually making products. So he's using his switch. His job coach measures out the ingredients for him to ensure the correct ingredient and the correct quantity, because honestly, Patrick doesn't know a quarter cup from a quarter teaspoon. But as his longstanding job coach says, if it's in the jar, Patrick put it there. And so oftentimes he will go to the grocery store. The three of us, myself, drive the van. I'm driving Miss Daisy. I'm driving the van with Patrick and his job coach, and we go to the grocery store for ingredients for his goodies. Or we'll go to the hardware store because he needs more ball jars. We'll go make a Michael's trip. He has to go to the dentist, so we'll sidetrack to Michael's to buy more ribbon for his jars. So it's not all production. And sometimes I say he's in supervising mode because when the labels go on, that's a pretty intricate job, which his job coach does for him. So she counts his inventory for him every week. So Patrick goes into supervisor mode at that point. But in terms of fun, when he's not working, like I said before, Patrick loves to swim. Last year we were fortunate enough to purchase a Von Ram Au Pair, which is an adaptive bike made in the Netherlands, very well engineered. It's basically, I'm checking it out because the wheelchair part of it is now living in our living room. But the front of it is basically a wheelchair, a freestanding wheelchair. And then there's a back component that hooks onto that has the back bicycle. So it's basically kind of like a reverse tricycle. Kind of reminds me of like a ice cream truck. And then the back is pedal assist. So it's an e-bike, which is good because between my husband, the bike, and Patrick, it's probably easily 500 pounds. And as you know, Vermont has a phenomenal rail trail system. We do not go on the roads, any one of us anymore. We stay off the roads. But the great thing about this bike is that it can be detached. So the wheelchair in and of itself is freestanding. Now, it's not quite as posturally correct as Patrick's ongoing wheelchair, his permanent, his everyday wheelchair, but it's and it's got really high handlebars because that is the handlebars for the bike. And there's still a mirror attached to it, and it's kind of, you know, it looks a little different. It's orange and black, and so it's got a very different look than his other wheelchair. But if you're on the rec path and you're like, hey, let's go eat in that restaurant, or let's peel off and get ice cream, you just very easily detach it, and then it becomes a wheelchair.
Nice.
Because the bike we had before, it was not a bike, it was a trailer, like a Patrick size Cannondale buggy, so to speak, which was difficult to get him in and out of. And you'd also get somewhere and Patrick was stuck in the trailer. And
Mm.
so this lends to so much more mobility. Patrick also does adaptive skiing. Patrick uses a sit ski or a bi-ski, so it's basically a contoured seat mounted on two skis. There's many different ways to do a bi-ski, a sit ski. Patrick is what they call guided seat assist. So Patrick is not able to weight shift to turn the ski. He so he's tethered for safety, but some people are just tethered and the ski's up ahead and you're using a leaning or your muscle tone to kind of shift the weight of the ski to turn. Patrick is not able to do that. But honestly, keeping your chest upright for that period with that momentum, even in spite of the harness, and your head upright with a helmet on for 2 hours is exhausting. And
Yeah.
Patrick really likes it. And they've been really working on, we're turning right, we're turning left. And he has started to really look to the side where he's going to go. Um,
I
so he enjoys that. But you know, he's pretty much game for anything.
I have to say it's a far different picture than when you described imagining sort of a medical day program and what that would look like. And I'm also just struck by how much it is, I would call it family occupation, right? That it is
Yep. Yep.
collective, these collective recreation activities that you do together, the biking, the skiing together as a family, the
Well,
swimming.
and we really plan our vacations now that we have this bike. You know, last fall, we planned a vacation. We drove because it's getting harder to fly with Patrick. Truthfully, transferring him. We have switched to a mechanical lift at home. And when we travel, we miss that mechanical lift. The older we get, the more we wish we had it. And it's getting very hard to load Patrick on and off of a wheelchair of a airplane seat. And then you need a aisle chair, and that is a whole, people always bring a wheelchair and you're like, no, no, not a wheelchair, an aisle chair. And so anyway, we've decided it's just about easier to drive than it is to fly. And so we set up a trip from here to Florida with rail trails in between. And so we would drive one day, we would ride a day. We'd drive one day, we'd bicycle a day. And so I say we bicycled to Florida. Well, no, not really, but just about. And then at the end, we had it planned to a T that we had one over, oh, I guess we gave ourselves 2 nights wiggle room. And then we did a Disney cruise, you know, because that's the kind of thing that works for Patrick. It's noisy. If he's noisy, it's not fine dining in the evenings, you know, and it's casual and it's very family friendly and kid oriented. And so, you know, it's not like we were on a Viking ship that was adults only, or, you know, so yeah, so no, he just is very much a part of our family.
Well, and I know you mentioned that your husband had been rooting for Florida at one point for some of the sailing and the beaches. So I noticed that made it into your family vacation, which is great.
But we're glad to come back from there now. I will tell you that we're happy with Vermont
Yeah, it's
for all
beautiful.
kinds of reasons.
Um, I'm sure you're asked this all the time, but uh, advice for families, for people in Vermont that are thinking about, and for the healthcare workers and the school practitioners, just thinking about really supporting some of our kids with their transition planning and sort of setting themselves up. Um, You have done a lot of really creative trial and error, but do you have any advice that you would want to share?
Well, I think, you know, I think in all honesty, for it to be successful, you do it being whatever sort of micro business you come up with, or self-employment. And this is a growing trend, a growing theme for people with disabilities. But I do think it's very imperative to have parent involvement. Um, there's quarterly income tax, not income, sales tax that needs to be filed with the state and paid. And for Patrick, the only two things he has that are taxable are the non-people things, his bird seed and his dog cookie treats. So it only ends up being about $7 a quarter. It's not very much, but someone needs to file those taxes and make sure they get paid. Someone needs to keep a profit and loss statement and a pretty close eye on that. Are we really bleeding here? Or are we making too much money? And does Patrick need a new pop-up tent for the markets or a new tablet, a new printer, that kind of thing? So I enter his information into QuickBooks. And, could a job coach be trained for that? Absolutely. Would that take away from Patrick's production time? Yes. Um, most of the time, his support at the markets is from George and I, or his respite provider. It's out of the day. Um, it's not within the typical working hours of the agency. Would they be willing and able to find someone to help staff that? Maybe. I don't want to push my luck and say you have to do an evening farmers market when I'm very thrilled to have you during the day, and I don't want to risk that. So I think the parent, and I'm sure I'm missing quite a few things. The parent involvement is key. Um, does the individual really like that activity, or is it more your idea? Is it a marketable product? There is a great business plan, and I think it's for people with disabilities, and I'm trying to remember who puts it out. It's ASK, Achieving Self-Employment Knowledge. And it's a business plan, but it's a really boiled down business plan that really talks to people with special needs. Um, I think, what do they enjoy doing? What are their strengths, and how can you build on those? Could they use assistive technology to enhance their job? I think the concept that I've said before of it's okay to evolve, don't feel like the first idea you have has to be the one that sticks. As you can see, and I probably forgot there was probably a few other plan C, plan D, plan E that I probably didn't even mention. So it's okay to evolve, and it's okay to continue to evolve. I guess that's the important nuggets I would take away.
And patience with staffing and a little
Right.
bit of luck.
Right. Right. Right.
Can I ask what are Patrick's top sellers these days? And where can we find his products if we want to?
Good question. Um, Patrick now has two items where he is paying it forward. So he has a Grandma Joe's Snickerdoodle. My kids called my mom Grandma Joe, and she had Alzheimer's, and she's the one that came out to Colorado with us, and really very supportive of all three kids, and then sadly later in life got Alzheimer's, and so this is her Snickerdoodle recipe, and $2 from every jar goes to the Vermont Walk to End Alzheimer's. And it's the purple color for the hang tag of Alzheimer's. And so that one ends up being a top seller because I promote that at markets kind of as, and furthermore, so that one ends up being a top seller. A relatively new one within probably the last year or so is Patrick's Mud Season Munchies. Um, and we've been trying to get more audience buy-in, more social media by help us name these cookies. This is what's in them. And then we had a, name that cookie contest. And then we chose, the job coach and I chose our top three and then put it out for a vote. And Mud Season Munchies won. It was mud season at the time, which probably swayed all of us. But they are very bumpy, lumpy, chocolatey, muddy kind of cookies. And $2 from that cookie goes to support Green Mountain Adaptive Sports. And Patrick actually donated almost $800 last year to Green Mountain Adaptive
Wow.
Sports. So yeah. And usually quite a bit to Alzheimer's as well. Although I will say he does a separate Walk to End Alzheimer's fundraising on Facebook. So people kind of happily throw money at that. So it's not necessarily that he sold 500 jars of cookies, but so, I don't know if he understands the concept of pay it forward, but I like to believe he does. And I know, George and I think it's a good thing to do.
Well, I, for one, definitely need some mud season munchies. So where can I go to find
Oh,
these?
right. So Patrick has a website, and so you can
We'll share
order
the link to
online.
that. Yep.
You can do that, purelypatrick.com. If you're local, you can do the pickup option, so you don't have to pay for shipping.
Marianne, thank you so much for your
Thank you.
your time. I have been really wanting to hear more about your family's story for a long time. So personally, I just really enjoy getting to talk with you. I have taken a lot of your time and I really appreciate your generosity. I have one last question, and it is kind of a big topic, but you have moved also into a lot of advocacy work. And I don't know if you feel like that is just a natural extension of your family life and your professional life. But could you speak just a little bit about how you've gotten involved, and any advice that you might have for others that want to become more involved in advocacy?
Yeah, that's a good point. I'm not in any formal advocacy group, but I kind of treat each and every craft show and farmers market as a educational opportunity. That, you know, I mean, it's always great for Patrick if he gets some mad money and can buy pizza and sell his products, because that'll keep his business going. But for me at a market, I'm more interested in that parent who comes up, and again, being in a high tourist area, that parent from New Jersey who stops and really reads Patrick's poster that's on an easel and really looks at Patrick and really reads the sign and says, this is really his business. And I'm like, this is really his business. I had no idea. And what is this picture on his poster? That's a sit ski. I had no idea. So I think for me, I've shared many a tears with many a parent who have just said, thanks for kind of opening my eyes that this is a possibility. And so I think it's just kind of a natural extension of being an OT and being a mom.
Well, I just really thank you for your time today, for all of your work with Green Mountain Adaptive Sports. Love seeing Patrick's products out in the community, and thank you so much for sharing some photographs of him. I'm hoping that we can share some of those also for people to get to check out some of Patrick's work in action and some of his recreation.
And thank you for all your time. I really appreciate it.